I think I know you guys like, I know I watch the analytics on all this stuff. I talk about different things for different reasons, but I know you guys like some of those inside stories. And when I first thought of doing this show and knowing that people want to hear some of that stuff, and I'm not trying to, I think if you've watched for the last month, I am not trying to intentionally drag anybody through the dirt. I will be honest about things, but I like to tell stories that people may not know because I think they're interesting. I have no interest in burying anybody. I don't want to, Matt Camp shoots on. Things are going to get captioned how they caption. I can't do anything about that. I really don't care. I like to tell stories that I think are interesting. And if you saw our promotion for today's show, you may know what I'm getting at. I had the story in my head, and I remember when it happened, I was like, I always joke to myself, well, that's for the book that no one will ever read. And this was one of those stories. You go back and you think about all the weird stuff that happened over the last 5 years in WWE, and then think about it from an insider perspective of somebody who was there. And when this happened, I remember, I went, oh, one day I'll get to tell this story. Today is that day. Today is the day we talk about how a little show called WWE's The Bump. There it is. Hey, Kayla. Hey, Kayla. That's what you're supposed to say, right? You have to say, there's my guy, Drew. I wanted to get him ready to point at WrestleMania signs. And Drew is involved in the story that we are going to tell. Drew McIntyre, I think, as everybody knows, from really that moment on right there, that's the 3 days after he won the Royal Rumble in Houston. Drew McIntyre became the face of WWE, but became the face of WWE at that time right there, no pandemic. That's the end of January of 2020. We know what happens a couple months later. We know that Drew McIntyre does win the WWE Championship in front of 0 people, which is a big part of his current day WCW story. Now I'm fantasy booking Drew in WCW. Think of that Yeti Drew McIntyre match we missed out on. Think of that Alex Wright Drew McIntyre match we missed out on, but they could do it Bash at Berlin. And now I've gone off on a tangent. Let's bring it back. But Drew McIntyre was the face of the company when he won the championship during the pandemic. He was the champion at a time that you don't want to win your first title, big title, but he did it. And he was out in front. And he was a friend of the bump right there. That's episode whatever. The second time he was on, he went on to be on the show like 20 times. And Drew took on everything that went with being the face of the company. Babyface, first-time champion, much like Cody's doing now, but in a much different world. And he would make appearances on the show, and they came up with that show Drew and A for him, and he was saying yes to a lot of things. I will say, I don't think people realize how big of a fan Drew is. They might now because of his social media and the references he's making and all that. I think people maybe know it a little bit more now. I'm moving Woodsy over since we moved Todd over there where you could subscribe at thewrestlingmatshow.com. But Drew's a big fan. I love talking to Drew about wrestling, but I also saw a guy who kept his emotions in check. And there's a documentary they did on him, and it was really good. And it shows you when he found out that Mania wasn't going to happen in front of people. And it's crushing. And obviously, and he'll tell you this as well, the pandemic was far more crushing for a lot of other people. People who lost their lives, people who got sick, people lost family members. But from a personal business standpoint, this was his time. This is what he fought back from getting released, to working the indies, to working the world, to coming back to WWE. This was the moment. And he was getting at the time, a rarity, an organic groundswell of support. Drew winning the Rumble, you could, if you were reading the tea leaves, you could see, okay, there's something coming here. But what was he? It had the heel run and stuff with Ziggler and NXT, and he was stuck with people he shouldn't have been stuck with. It just wasn't, the rocket ship wasn't there. But I remember saying on Corey Greer's podcast, and I've told the story recently, I think the day or two after the Rumble, right before that bump episode, that Drew winning the Royal Rumble as a first-time winner was the closest thing to Shawn Michaels in 1995. There had been a lot of people who had won Rumbles, but obvious, clear winners. But it seemed like, okay, this is a true launching point for top-of-the-company Drew McIntyre. And it was. And he knew that. And then pandemic changed everything. And he went with it. And I do appreciate that they're using that currently and used it heading into Mania and used it after the fact that he had the title for a matter of minutes after he won it at Mania this year in front of people. I appreciate using history and the real life aspect of it. And that's what's working for Drew. But back then, why he's bitter now on television in a way is because he was supposed to have the moment. I still remember being in Brooklyn. I still remember him taking Brock down 3 times. I'm pretty sure Brock called for a couple extra claymores because he heard the crowd. If you pay very close attention to that night in Brooklyn, that Raw leading into Mania, still fans in the crowd. The idea was Drew was showing he could take down Brock. And he hit a claymore, and he hit, I think, 2 more. And I think Brock calls for them from the ground because he knew. Brock is a very savvy businessman when it comes to wrestling. And he knew. He knew he was putting Drew over. And you got to build that guy up. So they were doing that. And it felt like on that night, Drew proved he was the right choice. Because you remember, in that Rumble, Brock was champ, and he goes to the first half of the Rumble, and then Ricochet hangs in there, and then Drew comes out, and there's the low blow from Ricochet, and then Drew hits the Claymore, and that's it. So he had won a little help, and then he goes and wins the Rumble. And it's all Edge's comeback, and Roman, and Randy, and you name it. AJ, massive. And Drew's going along, and he wins. And he's the champ. And he's making appearances. And he's fighting in the PC. And that goes into the Thunderdome and all that. And obviously, COVID hits. And everybody goes home. And there's shows being done from home. And, then people are, we're just making content however we can. And there's a whole episode, by the way, in the archives at thewrestlingmatchshow.com about WWE during the pandemic. But I'm talking about Drew here. Taking every opportunity to be the face of the company at a time when it was not easy to be that. And Drew took on all of those things. And he led the company through the pandemic. And part of that was making appearances on behalf of the company. And look, I always joke that Drew's setup at his house looks like a castle. He lives in, I think, Nashville. Spoiler, he doesn't live in Scotland full time. But his house has a very plain wall that he does his interviews from. And it looks like a castle wall. It's the way however it's finished behind him has that kind of look. And I was like, oh, you got a little castle wall. And he did all of his stuff from there. So he was doing all these media appearances and saying all the right things and all that. And as the months go by, this is not a political conversation. I'm not trying to have one. And you want to say the pandemic is political or not, I don't care. I'm not trying to have that conversation. I'm trying to tell a story. I just go by the Monstars anthem. If the refs get political, dribble like Bob Dole. That's what I think about politics. But Dr. Anthony Fauci was in the news a lot. And they're trying to get the word out about the vaccine and whatever, and okay. And, he was making appearances everywhere and on television and all that. And it comes out. I found this out. Oh, boy. I don't think I knew as it was happening, or maybe I knew right at the end. But, and I've said this on the show before, the bump, which is once again not on today. And I think we're going on 5 weeks now. The bump didn't get a lot of love within the company, but sometimes it was used in certain ways. The bump could make money for the company with sponsorships and things like that. And if you go back and watch some of those pandemic episodes, we have the most random people on that aren't wrestling people. We had the Property Brothers on. We had some YouTuber from Mexico who was massive. We had Ken Jeong. We had Joel McHale. We had Keegan-Michael Key. We had Randy Jackson because he was promoting Name That Tune. We had Joe Manganiello. You name it. So we had all these random people on, and they drew not that well because there was that wrestling bubble that I don't think people cared about celebrities. That's why I thought the Raw guest host never did that well unless they were in. Like Bob Barker was great because he was in on it. He liked to be part of it, like Mike Tyson was, like some of the others were. Other people, you get like Jeremy Piven going, oh, Summerfest, and just making the appearance. But we would have Ken Jeong, who famously got concussed appearing on, I think, the Raw with Jeremy Piven. He came on and he loved wrestling. There you go. Kayla interviewing McConaughey with Hacksaw because McConaughey was such a big Hacksaw fan earlier this year. That kind of stuff. If they were into it, it was a fun interview. But this was not about that. So conversations actually started and took place with the White House. For those of you outside of America watching it, first of all, thank you. Subscribe to thewrestlingmatshow.com. But the White House, the president. And there were conversations happening with the White House about this is a big global entity and it's another way to get the word out about Dr. Fauci, who became the main character of COVID and the pandemic, coming on to, there he is. Oh boy, where is this show going? That guy right there was going to appear on WWE programming to get the word out. I got to check the text. About getting the vaccine or vaccine awareness and all that. So actual communication did take place with the White House, and it was determined that this appearance, I think was discussed in a few different ways, would happen on the bump. Somehow that was the medium. And if you think about it, what else would it have been? Some kind of pre-tape they ran during Raw or SmackDown, maybe. But this was the only live talk show to do it on. So, okay. And it probably would have been pre-taped. We taped a lot of stuff during the pandemic. But the idea was, here is the right forum. Do it on the bump. And there were conversations. And I will tell you, I guess from a digital regime, it's like 1.5 regimes ago. And there was a trust in our show, and I will say a trust specifically in me and Kayla to handle that. Kayla was still hosting at the time, thank God. So part of the discussion was to involve top talent. Drew, why I brought him up, and the other name floated about, and I'm not going to speculate on anything, but Sasha Banks was the other name. Don't know if Sasha would have been on board with that completely. See SummerSlam a few years back, but it was supposed to be them. And it was going to happen. And I'm like 99% sure that Stephanie McMahon was on board with this. And very quickly on her. I'm sure she's done stuff to people or has been involved in stuff that people don't like or whatever, and that the retweet that's going to go down in infamy of, philanthropy is the new branding. I get it. That kind of stuff is cringy. She was very good to the bump. For everybody that said after Vince was gone the first time, it was good to have her around and in charge, and it was. She was not her dad in that way. She also wasn't nearly as intimidating as Vince, or as I've talked about in the past, Shane. She didn't come across that way. But she was I think her best role was kind of her last significant role in the company, which was that brand ambassador role. I think she handled that really well. And she was on board with this. And she was very good to the bump. She came on multiple times. I remember she came on when the BT Sports deal was announced, and she did like the shot from England because she was over there. And maybe not the best production decision. Her shot was basically like this. Like her whole face was in the shot as opposed to backing her up a little bit. And she says, like, I'm a little under the weather. I think I have a booger right there. Like, she made fun. She was fun in that way. But she had come on a couple of times. She came on for Women's History Month and all that. She was really good. And she was, as far as I know, on board with this idea. This fell under her purview, ambassador for the company. So it got pretty far down the line. And it had one more stop. Vince. Now, initially I was told that Vince was okay with it. Because you got to remember, not that everything goes through Vince or went through Vince, but a lot did. A lot. Like, he micromanaged to the point that it was a detriment. But this was a big deal. It was a big thing for the company. So he would have to sign off on this. And Vince didn't touch the bump. As I've said many times, we didn't get mentions on TV. Michael Cole refused to talk about the show because he didn't like it. Just refused. You go find bump plugs on television. Bump plugs. Let me say it again. BUMP plugs. Bump plugs. Go find the plugs. Go find the promotion. Go find it on Raw and SmackDown. You won't. A couple times on the bottom line, may have been mentioned like 4 or 5 times in the history of the show. But this was something significant. So when we're talking about the White House, Vince has got to stamp that. He's got to say that's okay. Initially, I was told he was on board. And when it came down to, hey, this is going to happen, the details have all been figured out. I don't know if in the end it was going to be Drew and Sasha. I think Drew was going to be involved. It was just going to be, I think, the idea was a round table discussion of the pandemic and, living in it and being entertainers in it and getting the word out about the vaccine and all that. But Vince had to give the final, and he did this. As you may expect, considered too political. It was one of the few times he got directly involved with the show that I know of. I was in tune with a lot of things going on. I don't know if everybody loved that, but I like to know what was going on. I don't know how that would have been received. If it became a political thing, I know how it would have been received. And I think you look back in history, while there have been pre-taped appearances, with like Obama and McCain. I think Hillary did one. Obviously, Trump made multiple appearances and all that. On television, on television, they stayed away from it. They stayed away from being political. You know, I remember, go back in the day. Rocks at the Republican National Convention, all this stuff. You know, rock the vote or whatever the hell. You know, smack down your vote. Wasn't that a thing? That was a thing. But they had gotten away from it. Yes, Jennifer Flowers did make that appearance. Thank you, Rob. And by the way, if you have questions, super chats, go right to the front of the line, especially about this subject. Get those in there. I will certainly answer them throughout the show. But Vince said no. And it didn't happen. That was the end of it. I think the intent was good. I would leave it. I would say that. I think the intent was good. I don't know how it would have been received. I think it would have been a big deal for the company to do it. But that was considered political. And at least, I guess, we'll just, I don't know. You know, you think about it as a fan. Have they done anything openly political on Raw or SmackDown or NXT or any programming? Not in probably a long time. Not involving it or anything like that. Despite, I think people have seen the picture of the family at the White House with Trump, right? Like, that happened, but in terms of putting it on Raw and SmackDown, not really not the case. And I guess this fell under that. We think this is political, so we're not going to do it. So Anthony Fauci did not join the esteemed guest lists that included such luminaries and great people like Drake Maverick. Who else is on the bump? Like Xavier Woods. Like one-time guest Stone Cold Steve Austin, who said he was a fan of the show, by the way. Oh, I like your show. You guys do your homework. Who else is on the bump that we have behind me here? Well, I wish Eddie Kingston was on the bump. I wish Eddie Kingston was on the bump. Kid was on the bump. Taker was on the bump. But Dr. Anthony Fauci did not join that esteemed group. Hey, this is Matt Camp. Thanks for checking out one of our recent clips from the Wrestling Mat. Why is someone so close to The Rock kind of throwing Cody under the bus?
Yeah, a lot of people won't engage with Jim Cornette. I did, just because I have a mark for Jim Cornette. And
Please subscribe right now. Hit the like and turn on notifications so you don't miss a thing. And I think you should listen to your TV partners. Let me tell you about WWE and a little insight. More subscribers means more content. And make sure you follow us on social media at WrestlingMat23 on both Twitter and Instagram.